Hi, I'm Tyler, and this is the Fox Fellow Film Critics. In this special episode of the show, we're going to be doing something a little different this week. We have a very special guest to do a very specific theme episode on Holy Fools in great cinema. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the show, brought to you by Groupthink Productions and FVTV. Joining us once again for the first time since our Lord of the Rings special is Professor Fulton-Brown from the University of Chicago.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Sure. How's it been for the past year since we did our episode?
Oh my gosh, adventure, adventure, adventure. And thanks to my being on your program here, I had practice on camera and I've been to Australia. I've done lots of talks, and so I hope everybody, if you like this conversation, I have lots of videos up on my own site.
Yay, I'm instituting the end of the world.
Yes, you are.
So I realized last night, while I was prepping for the show, I don't think I've ever asked you what kind of movies you actually like. I mean, because I know you are a medieval studies professor and you study theology, but I don't think I ever asked you about what your tastes are specifically. I mean, obviously, we have two films we kind of looked into for this, but what are your tastes, generally speaking?
Well, they've changed, and one of the massive changes that's happened for me has been since I was confirmed in the church. And this has sort of lots of layers and context and adventures and so forth, but the immediate upshot is I can't watch anything. One of the horrifying things is every single film I watch, although happily, because you gave me this task of thinking about something positive this time, most films I watch now turn horrible at some point. And I mean, like, strictly speaking, horror, that you go from a setup that seems comfortable and familiar and happy, and you know, in the structure of drama, that tends to be what goes on, right? You have a setup, a disruption, and then a resolution. But for me, nothing but horror happens. The disruption is usually, I mean, I was watching The Boys, right? What is that?
The Amazon show,
The
right?
Amazon show, right. And there's one character who's supposed to be the good character, the girl who's like Starlight, right? That she's supposed to be Christian. And it turns out in some episode or other, I forget which one it was, what I do is I protect myself by falling asleep. No, it's bad. It's really, really bad. So my family is watching this, and we get to the episode where she goes back to talk to the revival meeting that she sort of came out of, right? And they're doing the sort of the stars in the background and the rousing music and the inspirational speeches. And she stops, right? And then she does this sort of thing saying this is all a fraud, right? Now, you know, that is meant to, for the secular audience, comfort you, right? It's like, oh, look, these crazy Christians, we don't need to be taking anything that they say seriously because they're all hypocrites anyway, and behind the scenes her stretchy, like, pastor is confessing to having had sex with, it's like, oh my goodness. And that I realized, you know, in fact, all modern Hollywood and now television based entertainment is meant to disrupt the holy, right? And so I do have some reflections on the movies that I suggested we talk about. Fisher King had some elements in it that I'd forgotten about that point to the possibility of a true comedy, as far as I'm concerned. But The Jester is quite disruptive and very interesting. So I don't watch anything now.
That's going to make this film review show interesting. So you obviously, when we were talking about this, you brought up the idea of doing an episode on Holy Fools. I can only imagine why, but I watched.
Maybe your viewers don't know. Do you want to explain to them?
No.
Oh.
But I did watch the Jonathan Pageau video that he brought up, I think,
Right.
a couple weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I liked the way he kind of brought up this idea about how, in a time when chaos is kind of the reigning philosophy of the moment,
Right.
you can have these people like Kanye or Ricky Gervais just stand up to the world as it stands.
Or Milo.
Yes. And they can create such chaos that it kind of calls the system forth and tries to convince it to become more stable, become more orderly.
Yes.
And that there's a role for chaos in our lives, but then that chaos is put into the wrong place. It creates disorder, it creates problems, but that because in the case of the Holy Fool, you can use that against the system itself, obviously. You can make order from chaos, as a very famous Canadian professor once said.
Well, I'm not going to talk about that. So what Jonathan and I love Jonathan's perspective because he comes at it as a visual artist, right? As opposed to, from my perspective, I'm coming from the text and the scriptural exegesis and the liturgical practice. But he himself is a convert to Orthodox Christianity, and I did once ask him on one of the videos we did together, how do you know what you're seeing? And he said it came from the work that he's doing with the images, right, from the art. And so his perspective is informed by this problem of making beauty, right, and what it means. And the talk he gave here in Chicago last autumn was on that, you know, what place does beautiful art have in the modern world, particularly in liturgical context. His main thing that he talks about a lot, which you saw in that Fool video, is this problem of inversions, right? That we take something, and that's what I was describing from the boys, right? You take something that's stable, apparently normative, and flip it, and that flipping in comedic terms or satirical terms is what reveals the truth that has been hidden throughout all of the conformity that people have been feeling pressured into, I suppose. But there's insidious ways in which society creates that kind of sense that to go against the present order is dangerous and offensive and so forth. In comedy, this chaos, right, is typically pointing you to that discomfort that you have about the thing that cannot be said.
Sure. And in both the case of these movies that we both picked, you picked Court Jester and I picked Fisher King, you kind of see good examples of that. You see examples of the fool kind of raising heck and changing either society or the individual.
Right.
So what brought you to Court Jester then if you aren't watching that many films anymore?
Oh, well, it was good because a friend of mine who's a fencer mentioned the 19 scene, which he has to be sort of sped up through his training, as it were, because he's been a jester and they need him to be a knight for the final duel, and they don't have time in order to make sure that the marriage that they want to happen happens, to let him actually train for several years, and so they do this sort of speeded up version, and it's kind of the opposite of the montage, right, that you get in Karate Kid or training movies like that. It's like, you know, the hero goes off to the hermitage and trains for some time and then comes back out as a knight. It just speeds it up, right, so that the comedy is there. I'm also, for a lot of personal cultural reasons, very interested in this problem of fools and jesters, and I was curious about this movie because I've been trying to understand exactly where the jester comes from in medieval culture and theater, right? And what's interesting, this thing about you're saying the chaos comes and it overturns the social order. In fact, and this happens in Court Jester too, in fact what happens is the fools come in, point to the way in which the proper hierarchy is not being observed, and it's comedic because by the end the hierarchy is restored. And that actually fits. There's a book on the medieval fools plays by Elizabeth Arden, where she talks about the genre of the fool play from the late 15th century through to the Shakespearean period, right? That's this sort of high period of this kind of comedy. And the fools, the sots, right, they're sort of Three Stooges like. There's often three of them. They're all about sort of quick exchanges, verbal wordplay and stuff like that. But in the end, what the sots do is call out the king, call out the ecclesiastical hierarchy, call out the high, guild masters and so forth for not behaving as they should, right? So what's interesting about the jester play is it actually restores order rather than claiming that it's wrong to have order.
The truism I've always heard is that the Joker, or not the Joker, the jester is the one person that can always tell the truth in a room because they're below the king's contempt.
Yep.
So they can go into a space and call everyone out, and he's not going to get in trouble with anyone because no one thinks highly of him. But in doing so, he's able to bring some order to it, and that's kind of and I love how that's explored in The Court Jester. I mean, it's kind of, when I started watching it, it kind of, in the first few minutes, it made me kind of think this was going to be like a Robin Hood-esque like ripoff musical. And then I kept watching it, and it was like, okay, so the main character is this jester who's pretending to be Robin Hood, and then eventually they decide to have him infiltrate the castle because the true king is this young baby who has been robbed of the throne by this elderly king, and the generic merry men out in the middle of the woods must protect the child and find a way to reinstall the true heir of the throne. Mm-hmm. Very classical, very classical medieval story, and it's fun watching how the court jester character specifically is the one who's drives the plot in all of this. He infiltrates the castle as a jester, and he stands up and he makes a fool of himself in front of everyone, and finally he's the one that ultimately has to have the duel and throws the king into the ocean in the most wonderful use of a trebuchet in cinematic history.
That's actually his evil henchman, right, Basil Rathbone?
Was it?
Yeah, not the king. The king, in fact, ended up recognizing the baby.
Okay.
In the end, but so there's elements. You could say it's classical. It's still a kind of Robin Hood ripoff, but it's the Robin Hood ripoff of Ivanhoe, Walter Scott's Robin Hood, right?
Okay.
Who is the Robin Hood character in that movie is the one who holds the order, right? That they in that movie, in that book, that and in that book, it's not a baby that's being recognized, but it's Richard the First, right? And there is the sort of historical layer of reality in that there are stories of minstrels acting as sort of spies or agents in a variety of medieval contexts, particularly in English history, one of which is the minstrel who gets close enough to the castle where Richard's being held prisoner, sings, he hears Richard singing, and that's how they discover where Richard's being held. So there's several layers of historical there. What you talk about with the Danny Kaye character, the fool, so he starts off impersonating the Robin Hood character, right, the fox, right, and the real fox comes and says, "Stop wearing my clothes," right? So there's that, costumes and can you tell who the character actually is by the costume that he's wearing, and that's complicated. But there's another element which is a very interesting gender play. The movie's made in 1956, and so there's all sorts of surprises if you watch it. What you learn not only is the fool not actually the fox, but the main sort of lieutenant of the fox is a woman, right? She's captain, and she's there as the archer captain and so forth, and leading the troops in the forest, right? And the fool, you learn, is in love with her, but she says, well, she can't be a woman until they've restored the baby to his rightful inheritance. And there's two sort of parallel scenes in the movie. At the beginning, in the forest, they have the baby, and the fool has to hold the baby and show his bottom, right? Because that's where the
I'm gonna cut you off right
purple
there.
pimpernel.
We're gonna go to commercial real quick. We'll be right back. All right, you were saying about the purple. I can't say words.
The purple pimpernel. The purple
Yes.
pimpernel. And so the other thing about the movie is it's very famous for some of these medieval-esque wordplay tongue twisters, right? We will not go into the chalice from the palace is the whatever poison pill.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so in the forest, the fool has to hold the baby and show the men his bottom, right? And he protests. He says, "I think a woman should be doing this," right? It's very interesting. And there is a woman, but she's dressed as a soldier, right? She's a captain at that point. So you say that society is upside down. That the baby should be the king, and the woman should be the one holding the baby, and the fool is not a warrior, but a buffoon, right? And he and the captain end up having to take the baby. They end up being trapped into being in the castle together, and so shenanigans. But they have a conversation about he saying whether she, as a woman, could love him even though he's not a man of arms, right, a warrior. And so I mentioned that one of the things that drew me to the movie was that scene where he's comically elevated to knight, which he isn't, right? It's all ridiculous. They throw him over the wall instead of he's having to climb it. They give him, instead of the great boar, to wrestle a piglet and so forth. So again, the initiation into manhood is also inverted. But in the end, because he's been hypnotized by the witch, he's able to fight a true duel with the bad guy, and in fact, therefore, become the warrior. So that by the end of the movie, the resolution scene, after the dwarves help, etc., more shenanigans. The resolution at the end is the captain is now dressed in women's clothes, descends from the ceiling in the court, holding the baby. It's a very Marian image because there's like festivals in medieval in Europe that use this kind of swing, right? So she descends from heaven with the baby, and when the people are now recognizing the baby as the rightful king, she's holding it. And then the fool has now shown himself as a man, and so they can get married. So you can see that the comedy there is classic in the sense that it ends in a wedding, hers and his, and that it restores the men to their chivalric role and the women to their nurturing, mothering role.
Society is returned to order by continued absurdity.
Yes, yes, but also, this tension between, it's like the disruption is the chaos, and the fool is the one that can point them to the actual true hierarchy that society should be observing.
Yeah, and then the rest of, and the society and the groups that realize that everything is out of order just lets the absurdity build until everything is reset, so.
Well, so the thing is, the question is whether it will reset on its own,
Well, there you
right?
go.
And that's the sort of terror of, if you don't have the fool pointing out the hypocrisies and the lies and the deceptions and the evil, will it be restored?
Okay, I mean, I'm moving to the second film. I'm curious as to what you thought about this one, because my read on this was, I mean, obviously my instincts as a Christian and a writer tend to lean on more optimistic views of art, as my flawed faith articles generally suggest.
Mm-hmm.
I like to see what the positives are and see how these themes kind of blossom regardless of what the intention of the author was. But with this, I kind of saw Fisher King as a kind of individual salvation story more than anything else. I mean, because obviously you have the character played by Jeff Bridges, or is it Jeff Daniels or Jeff Bridges? I'm forgetting. And he is a terrible, egotistical person from the outset of the film, and he does something that creates this horrific massacre and loses his entire reputation, and it ends up being this drama between him and the victim of this act he does, who's essentially playing the role of like a Don Quixote-esque kind of fool. Mm-hmm. And through his interaction with him, he learns how to become a more humble person and attain a kind of salvation just through the interaction of learning what it is he needs to become to become the right person within his own eyes. And I'm curious as to what it was that kind of bugged you about it, or if my read is completely off on that.
Well, so when we were talking about the movies, I said I saw The Fisher King in the theater when it came out,
Sure.
Right? And I had strong memories of it, but I couldn't remember that it was a comedy, right? Which which was very interesting. It was like, because the way Gilliam directed it, it's very dark in all of its lighting. It's typical sort of that gray washed out, even in the happy scenes, right? So it's ambiguous to me whether or not the characters are saved in the end. But speaking of the gender roles, right? The horrible thing that happens is Henry's wife is shot in front of him, right? And so he loses his love. She's blonde tresses and quite beautiful and everything, and all you see her is in his memory of that moment when her head exploded. and he's haunted by that, he's wounded by that, and will he ever be able to recover his ability to have love again, which is horrible for him because he's driven mad because he lost his love. And I noticed that, there are two supporting female characters whose actress names I forget, although the woman who plays, I can't know nobody's names.
Me neither.
The woman who plays the video shop owner the actress herself won more awards, I think, than anybody else for the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting. And so she's a business owner, and you expect her therefore to be, sort of modern kind of woman. And both she and the woman that Henry fall in love with insist that they're not, right? That the video shop owner says, I'm not going to stick around for you just, living with me and being a bum. I want to be something. I want to, get married. I want to be your wife. And wow, you should know all these names.
It says on the back of the box. It's Mercedes Royal and Amanda Plummer.
Right, and Amanda Plummer's character does this whole wonderful fast forward on their first date, saying, you're going to come up, we're going to have sex. I'll wake up the next morning, and you'll never answer back. I don't want that. I'm not that woman, right? That you realize that both of the women want real relationships and want true love and romance. And in the end, that's what they get, right? That's like the Amanda Plummer character takes care of Henry while he's catatonic. The video shop owner keeps, and she sort of sticks around so that she's available when he comes back. But so in fact, that movie restores, again, order, because they want the marriage relationships, they want the love. It's really unclear to me in the mood of the movie whether that is the happy ending, right? It's so, it's modernity not being sure about marriage.
Yeah, in regards to marriage at least. The movie there's a lot of implied chivalric themes, implied things. Obviously the titular Fisher King story happens about halfway when Robin Williams is sitting naked in a park, as he was wont to be. But he talks about this wonderful story of a person who's given a quest to find the Holy Grail, and he spends his entire life empowered trying to find it, and he gives up, and the moment he finds it is the moment when some poor child walks up and gives it to him, which I kind of thought to me is Jeff Bridges' entire character arc right there. It's learning to receive forgiveness and forgive yourself and not try so hard to rebuild yourself in the aftermath of doing something really bad, which is grace. Which I think, to me, that is. It's a movie about a very uptight and sinful person learning to become a graceful person, or learning to become a person who can accept grace. And I think that's a lesson he can only learn through the Fool. He can only learn it through someone who's running around New York City like the Don Quixote-esque knight.
Right.
And that's how I got of it. I don't know how much it fits with the holy fool archetype as you've been discussing it, but
well, I think very intimately, because the thing about all of this is you have to let yourself enter into that story, right? And my obsession with all of this is that problem of having made a fool of myself in certain respects, in academia's eyes, by taking up this role in sort of culture conversation and allowing myself to become ridiculous by being associated with Milo, and what that means for one's willingness to take the risk the story lands you in. Jeff Bridges, he doesn't want to go and steal the trophy cup, right, from the guy. But in the end, in doing it, saves the man's life, because the owner of the castle has tried to kill himself that night. Because Jeff Bridges is there stealing the Grail, he saves his life. So there's sort of accident of compassion, right, in that moment. But his redemption only comes when he can allow himself to don the Don Quixote ridiculousness and submit to the story, right? So I am deeply, deeply interested in that, because as far as I'm concerned, that's where the imitation of Christ is always in joining us. We must become fools for Christ in order to receive that grace. And if you are standing on, your status in the world and people's, approval, and that sense that you'll embarrass yourself if you, surrender to the invitation to praise. You will, you're in this fake hierarchy. You're in this satanic hierarchy, which is all about prestige and recognition and nothing about the actual submission to God.
Sure. I did want to bring up additionally, Terry Gilliam would definitely qualify for not necessarily a holy fool, but I think he definitely qualifies as the archetype in a sense, because my goodness, I have never seen someone, I don't know that many film directors who are as willing to snub people as he is. Like, he has tons of news stories nowadays where he'll be running around and like, he'll declare himself a black lesbian woman on camera just to make a point.
Oh, okay, yes, okay,
or
good.
he does lots of absurd things to get people who are more prudish to kind of get mad at him. I mean, obviously, he's used to be the guy who would run around saying, like, there's no such thing as a terrorist, they're just revolutionary. He's one of those kind of types from back in the day. But I think there's something to him in being a fool too, because reading his biography last year, he understands everything he's doing. Because he talks about growing up in the U.S. in the 1950s and becoming a hippie, and obviously knowing the things you're fighting against. And I think he's moved from being like a old school hippie to being kind of a new, fighting against the new hierarchies, because he doesn't respect hierarchies in any sense. So,
well, but this is what's interesting about the restoration of hierarchy that the fools accomplish, which is, the harmonious order, the order that's in harmony with, you could say, our creation, right? That we're meant to be male and female and have marriages and children, and the women take care of the children, and those sorts of horrible to say things that we're not allowed to say anymore because shocking, right? Not received opinion. You're bigoted and awful if you point this out. That social pressure is always what the fool is pushing against the greatest. And it's interesting that people profess to like fools, but they don't, right? They'll shun and destroy them if they can, because the fool is ultimately a mirror, right? The fool is and that's, the mirroring in the Fisher King, that Jeff Bridges has to put on the costume of the fool in order to accomplish the quest, that the fool holds, and that's it, that Jeff Bridges only sees himself for who he is when he can see himself reflected in the foolishness of Robin Williams' character. There is an ambiguity, though, for me at the end of Fisher King, where they're both lying naked in Central Park, talking and happy and married and so forth, but Pinocchio is still lying between them. And Pinocchio is the image of lying, right? And so you're saying, it's like, have they given up lying? Have they gotten to the point where they're actually able to see themselves clearly and naked? Or is there still a lie sitting there between them?
Well, there you go. That's all the time we have for this episode of the Fox Valley Film Critics. I appreciate you coming on again.
Thank you.
If you want to find past recordings of the show, you can do so at the Group Think Productions YouTube page. You can follow me on Twitter at AntisocialCritI. That's critic about the C at the end of it. And you can find my written reviews at Geeks Under Grace. I'm Tyler with the Fox Valley Film Critics. Have a wonderful day.